But it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not.
Hi, welcome along to NUFC Matters with me, Steve Wraith. This is a special episode which John and I talked about on a couple of occasions, and he dropped me an email and said he'd like to do it in the summer. So here we are with a music special, John, something a little bit different. And many of the regular viewers will know you as the man who covers Newcastle United and obviously a bit of boxing as well in your time. But you're also a bit of a music connoisseur, John. So tell me more.
Passionate as it's possible to be, Steve. Not quite as passionate as with NUFC, or not quite for so long, but very, very much the second love of my life after Newcastle United. And started way back when I was a bairn. Now, when we were going to do this, I'll delve back into a few things that I haven't seen since I was in short trousers. And there they were, and I thought, right, we'll start with them, we'll have a bit of fun. I mean, if I go back far enough, and what I think is good is that I haven't seen some of the legends when they played in Newcastle back in the day when I was a bairn. For example, Bill Haley and the Comets, just after rock and roll, Walk Around the Clock come out. All used to Elvis and all that sort of thing. Bill Haley come to Newcastle with the Comets. I've got the date here, February the 16th, 1957, big man. Can you imagine that?
Wow.
He appeared at the Odeon in Newcastle, in the main road. He was staying in the Royal Station Hotel, and it was swarming with kids. And I couldn't hear him for all the squealing with all the girls. You could see him, he's double bass guy rolling about on stage and everything, but you couldn't hear a thing. That was the program for Bill Haley appearing in Newcastle back in 1957.
Pristine condition, John. I didn't expect anything different.
Well, it's because it's never seen the light of day since 1958. The year later, I think that's what made it so good. And what I remember about those days, in particular, Steve, was that I saw two of the all-time greats. I don't know if I was a jinx or something, but I saw two of the all-time greats just before they died. Literally, I went to see Eddie Cochran at the Empire Theatre in Newcastle. That was just up from the old Chronicle buildings when the Chronicle buildings were in the big market. It got demolished in the late 60s. But the date Eddie Cochran was at the Empire Theatre was March 23, 1960. And he was only 21 years old. He was on a British tour, and at the end of that tour, he was killed in a car crash after being at the Bristol Hippodrome. He was only 21 years of age. I saw him in the March, and in the April, he was killed in a car crash. Absolute tragedy. But that sort of bill they had in those days, not only did I see Eddie Cochran, but Gene Vincent in the Blue Caps. Gene Vincent, Bebop Lula, Billy Fury, Georgie Fame, all on the same bill. They do 2 shows a night. And I got in for 3 and 6pence to see stars of that caliber. And if he was unlucky at that stage, there's Buddy Holly. I saw Buddy Holly at the City Hall in Newcastle, Buddy Holly in the Crickets. He was on March the 6th, 58, ticket 8 and 6. I had to splash out that night. A year later, having gone home, he died in a plane crash, and he was only 23. So I saw both of them, on virtually, certainly the last tours of this country. Buddy Holly, there he is. Look at there's the cricket. Look at the Crickets. I mean, how corny can you get? I mean, that's about as corny as you can get. That's the ticket. The stub of my ticket for Buddy Holly in Newcastle. And the Chronicle, bless them, in those days brought out special editions. And that was a special edition for the cricket souvenir, it says, rather than Buddy Holly. And oh boy, they're in town. That was the Chronicle. Brilliant. You know how it's amazing. Brought out papers like that and those, but that was the great days of newspapers when they were selling a bomb. And the amazing thing, the daft thing about those is the backup artists. You know, there were really variety shows. I mean, nowadays you get the big star act, and there he is on stage, and he might get one warm up in the first half. I mean, in those days, Bill Haley, complete rock and roller. On before him is the Vic Lewis Orchestra with Kenneth Earl and Malcolm Vaughan, who were two crooners. I mean, the Buddy Holly show up here, the Tanner sisters, and a very young Des O'Connor was on as a chanter. He wasn't on as a comedian. He was on as a singer, right way down the bill in the daft old days. And I went and saw Pat Boone, Funky Lyman, the Teenagers, Paul Anka, Tommy Steele. I mean, all of them. And it was the obsession of my life. I lived in Benwell in the West End of Newcastle, and went to school up there. The thing at the time to be really cool was that you had to wear Billy Eckstine colours. You probably haven't heard of Billy Eckstine.
No.
He was an American crooner, and he had to wear the Billy Eckstine colours. And I used to walk up to school and walk back. Two of the guys in my class were Bill Steele, who then became a top man on Tyne Tees television, a presenter on Tyne Tees television, and a lad called Gavin Taylor, who was very big on the Tube. Remember when the Tube was in Newcastle? He was big on the behind the scenes on the Tube, made a lot of videos with people like Elton John, etc., etc. Early days and great days to look back on, with, you know, when not many people can say they saw Buddy Holly in this country. They saw Buddy Holly and Eddie Cochran because they died so quickly. They made the one tour, and I managed to see them both. I mean, as I was beginning to find my way with Newcastle United in the job I wanted to do, one of the great loops that made things happen was my friendship with Ian Lafreniere, who you know, of course, Steve. Ian became a very, very big friend of mine, mainly through his love of Newcastle United. I mean, I remember there was his mum was called Auntie May. Everybody called her Auntie May. And I remember her saying to my wife when we were living in Whitley Bay this day, she said, is your husband John Gibson, the reporter? She said, yeah. And Auntie May said, she said, my son would love to meet him. He's a Newcastle United fanatic. He works in London, etc., etc. And she said, yeah, next time he's up, give us a bell and we'll come round. Didn't know who he was at all. Got a bell, come round that night, and it was Ian Lafreniere. The Likely Lads had just made it big time. It was before we'd his pet, and we become great, great friends. He followed Newcastle all over Europe in those early days when we were winning things. And as you can see, it was velvet jacket, flared jeans, and long hair in those days. I remember going down to London with him. We'd been to Newcastle, and we were travelling back down to London, and he had a roller in those days. Everybody with any sort of edge had to have a roller. That was the big thing. So he's in a roller, and he's driving it, and he's got the velvet jacket and the jeans, and I'm next to him dressed the same way. And we got a pull off the cops on the way down to London, and the pull was that we'd nicked the roller, like, because the cops had took one look and thought those scruffy so-and-sos couldn't own that, so we'll give them a pull. And really what Ian wanted to do, he was so successful, but what he wanted to be was a rock and roller himself. He was as obsessed with music as I was. He wanted to be a rock and roll star, and he got involved. Elton John's was one of the first tours, Steve, behind the Iron Curtain, when he went over to Russia, and Ian Lafreniere went with him to do a film of Elton John, the man breaking all the boundaries in Russia, etc. He did that film. He's now living in LA. He's still working, as you probably know, Ian, and his next door neighbor over there is Ringo Starr, which is not bad for a little Geordie lad.
Fantastic.
He says, unfortunately, he's dragged because the two wives got on great. Ian's wife and Ringo's wife. he gets dragged to all Ringo's concerts now. You know, he's formed his own band, and I think it's a bit purgatory. It's not quite up the standard of the Beatles, like, but he's got to go along and go, yeah, 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 in the background. But, just to appear sociable. I mean, one of my great loves in those days, Steve, was Rod Stewart. I mean, everybody loved Rod Stewart, the music, whatever. And as you probably know, he was a football fanatic. He'd played at QPR to no particular standard, just as a kid, and he was fanatical about football. So once a year, the annual Football Writers Association dinner, which was always held, Steve, on the Thursday night before the FA Cup final on the Saturday. And I used to take a few of the boys along to that. Ian inevitably went as my guest. And then it shut down by about midnight and everybody went out onto town and did their own thing. In this particular year, Ian noticed that 2 tables down, Rod Stewart sitting there because of his love of football. So he said to me, hey, look, we'll go down, say hello to Rod and probably have a few drinks with him after the show. So sure enough, when the Football Writers thing was dying out, we went down, saw Rod, and he was full of bonhomie. And this was the time when Rod Stewart was going out with Britt Ekland, who was the film star, the Swedish girl, etc., etc. So he said at the end, he said, look, I tell you what, he said, we'll go and have a few drinks in town. And he says, we'll go back to my gaff. He was staying in a big hotel. He had a suite of rooms. Play a few records, have a bit of fun, etc. He says, I'll just phone the missus, which was Brit, to let her know. Like, well, there wasn't mobiles in those days, so he had a phone on the landline. So there he is at the Football Writers on a landline, and we can see him rabbiting away. And it's obviously not going quite according to plan. So he come back to see the pair of us, and he said, hey, we can't do it, mate. We said, oh, what's wrong, mate? He said, Brit says, if you think you're bringing a load of drunken footballers and hacks over here to have a party, you've got another thing coming. Get your backside back here as quick as you like. And I thought, isn't that terrific? I mean, if Rod Stewart is getting earache off his girlfriend because he wants a night out, then it just shows he's human, the same as the rest of us. Like, and I thought, yes, I'll have a bit of that. Well done, you mate. A little bit later, I'm doing a show at Time Tease Television, which was a live show, a debate. They were going to. It wasn't just about sport, but they were going to do a sports segment on the debate. So I'm sitting in makeup, and they're ladling the old makeup on, which takes a bit of doing in my case. And in the next chair, it's this girl who I can't quite see with curlers in. Curlers looking as if she was Zena Sharples off Coronation Street, you know. And I turned around and it was Britt Ekland in curlers getting made up to go and sit in the studio with us and then go on. But I mean, she was the most stunning lady. I mean, no wonder he went back home when he was told, when it was Britt that was telling him to do it, because that's the way it was in those days. But it was great. It was great with Lafferty because, I mean, he organised 1974, Steve, when we played in the FA Cup final. He organised everything. Can you imagine these days, you know, Newcastle United said the after-match Wembley party was organised by Ian Lafferty for everybody after the FA Cup final. The night before, he organised for all the wives and me, the players had to be in bed, of course, all the wives and me, to go out the night before to see Michael Crawford in one of the big shows, I think it was Barnby or what, in London, one of the big musicals, which Ian had written. And we spent the night at that, and I always remember, as a side, we played in the cup final. It was 1974, and we were lucky to get nil, as you will probably remember, Steve. We played Liverpool and got well toused 3-0. And I always remember at the party afterwards, Lafferty was there with me, and Lord Westwood come across to say, how you doing? And, you know, thanks to Ian Lafreniere, who launched this tirade against him that if you didn't get your finger out and sort Newcastle United out, do you think you're ever going to win anything again? And of course, we haven't won anything again, as you well know. Although, please God, it's going to change now. But I mean, every time there were happy days, which you took for granted then, but they were so different. Every time I went to London for a Newcastle game, and there was so many in London, there still is now, I would meet up with Ian and we'll go for lunch before the game. Then he would come in the press box with me to watch the game. And I mean, at lunch, one day it was Roman Polanski. The next day it was Ian McShane, who was Lovejoy. And Lovejoy was often written by Lafreniere. And of course, McShane was football mad. His dad played for Manchester United. Rodney Buse was there, etc., etc. So there were happy days. And really, what opened up a whole new era for me as well was the making of Wheelsend Pet, which came next along, Steve, and introduced a lot of Geordies, as you know. I mean, there was other people, Timothy Spall from Birmingham, and the wrestler from Bristol, etc., etc. But Tim Healy and Jimmy Nail, two of the great guys in the show, they were all unknown. And that was the fabulous thing about Off Wheels and Pet. They were unknowns. And that was deliberate. The idea was, we don't want it driven by superstars, where you're watching the superstar and not the program. We want it driven by the show and the words and the fun in the camaraderie. And I remember when Jimmy Nail was shown there, when I remember talking to Lafreniere when he was doing all the auditions, and one of the big parts was going to be Oz, who was this big Geordie yobbo who was rough and ready and whatever. And he said he was sitting there at the auditions, and the door opened, and this face looking like a well-smacked backside peered round the side of the door and shouted, "Hey lads, do you know what all the auditions are for this Geordie thing?" And Ian turned round to Dick Clement, his partner, and said, "Please God, let him be able to act just a little bit, because if ever that's ours, and we want him for us." And he become an absolute superstar with us. Jimmy Bradford, as you know, Nail, but why, he's a hard man. But his background was always singing and doing this music thing. He was in the King Crabs, which is a delicately named group, if ever there was one, which was punk, King Crabs. And his sister, Val McLean, was an actress who appeared in a lot of these things. I remember she ran for a while the press club in Newcastle, where we used to hang out in the afternoon, when we just popped in for a swift half that turned into a swift bucketful, which turned into a all-night job. And she ran that. But I mean, when we think of Jimmy Nail, terrific voice. You've got to say, I mean, Ain't No Doubt, Crocodile Shows, Love Don't Live Here Anymore, Big River on about the time. I mean, for me, it was super stuff. And I still see him to this day, because my hairdresser is on the main street through Gosforth, and he uses the same hairdresser. He's retired and lives just nearby, and he comes in there for his hair and says, "Hey, has Gibbo been in recently?" Etc. So
looking for the lowdown on what's happening at St James's Park, obviously.
Oh, that's one of the other things. He just wants to know everything that's going back off. And funny enough, I saw him not so long back. I think it was Steve Black's funeral. Remember Steve, when Steve Black, who we all loved, died, and I was at his funeral, and all of a sudden I come out and it's packed with faces. And the first one I see when I come out of the church was Jimmy Nail standing on the side, and I went across and said, "Jimmy, big hug." And the amazing thing, can you believe this? He said, "You'll never believe it, Gibbo. This is my birthday, and I'm at the funeral of one of my great pals. You know, one of his great pals is getting cremated on the day of Jimmy's birthday. But Jimmy was terrific, and you know, a lot of good memories of Wiedersempet. A lot of people have found Jimmy difficult and said he was difficult and that. I just felt he was terrific, and was very, very good at the job he did. But he was us. He got refined later on. By the time he was Crocodile Shoes, he was a detective, and by the time he was singing all the great songs, he was something of an unexpected heartthrob. But he was. The great thing is, and you'll know this because you're a music man, Steve, is that the Northeast is produced an awful lot of top pop stars, haven't they?
Yeah, they have. I mean, it's a great place and continues to do so. Sam Fender being the latest.
Yes, I was going to say right away up to Sam Fender. If you go way back to my time when I was coming up around the same age as them, the Animals were one of the biggest of the lot. I was a very good pal of Chas Chandler, who was in the Animals, and later on managed Jimi Hendrix, of course. Hank Marvin and Bruce Welsh went to Rutherford Grammar School, just up the road in Benwell there, and they were very much part of the Shadows, which was Cliff Richard's lot. And you get on to the superstars like Sting, Mark Knopfler, Brian Ferry, Brian Johnson, AC/DC, Neil Tennant coming up nearer today's time with the Pet Shop Boys, and Sam Fender now, absolutely terrific.
Don't forget Eric Burden as well. I'm only saying that because there's me with Eric.
Well, yes, you've got a right to say it. And he was, when I mentioned the Animals and you, Chas Chandler, his voice, Steve, his voice was, I say it was, and still is, when he did a concert up here not so long ago, was absolutely terrific. And he was a blues man, really, and superb. Great advocate of the Northeast, who, had he not gone away and he chose to live in Germany and play in Germany, etc., could have been a superstar on the world stage for ages. He was with the Animals initially anyway. The funny thing is, Mark Knopfler, just talking about name dropping, who was effectively brought up in Newcastle. His mum was a local lass. His dad was Hungarian, hence his surname. But his mum moved down here again with his dad when Mark was only 7, and he was brought up in Newcastle from then on. Newcastle United fanatic. Went to Gosforth Grammar School. We know somebody that went there, Lord Shearer. And the amazing thing was, and it's only afterwards you realise who he was. When he was a little kid, when he was 13, he used to come in the Chronicle on a Saturday afternoon to run copy for us on the Football Pink. He ran the copy from my desk at the Chronicle over to the, because it was paper in those days, to put it up the chute to go and get set on a Saturday afternoon towards the Pink edition. A 13-year-old lad. I mean, you didn't realise at the time what he'd become. Else I would have called him Sir, so I could get into see shows easier. Instead of him having to call me Sir at the time, just this little lad. But I mean, the interesting thing was that he wanted to do that, and it was for pocket money. But he also wanted to be a journalist because he studied journalism for a year at Harlow College, and he was a junior reporter on the Yorkshire Evening Post. Now, if he'd stuck in instead of getting diverted into this silly nonsense about music, he might have made it big as a journalist.
I don't think he regrets it quite as much, John, as you probably feel it, mate.
I don't think he did. The interesting thing from those days was there was this old guy in the Chronicle building that kept himself to himself, Steve. He sat on a long desk of news sub-editors, not sport, and he sat on the far end, and his job was just to look after the shipping forecasts. which told you what the weather's going to be like here, there, all the way around Britain. And he just subbed them and sent them up. And this little guy who was terribly inoffensive, hardly said anything, was actually called Basil Bunting, who was one of the greatest poets this area has ever produced. I mean, ever produced. Basil Bunting, who then went off, when he was so old it was untrue, went off to America and become a superstar, etc., etc. And the young Knopfler used to just look across at him and perhaps he wondered, I don't know what it was, but by 2015 he did a track on one of his albums, which was a special tribute to Basil Bunting from when he met him in the Chronicles. So happy days. Basil was a terrific guy and so talented, and yet he sat for donkey's years at the bottom of a table in the Chronicle just doing the shipping forecast. Amazing. One of my great mates in Eula was Brian Johnson, AC/DC. But, of course, when he started, he was the front man of Geordie. And there he is with me. The tale behind that photograph, which is dead interesting, is that I was doing talkings round the area with Kevin Keegan. This is when Kevin Keegan just arrived as a player.
82,
And he was doing shows all over the Northeast. Part of his deal with Newcastle is that Scottish and Newcastle Breweries topped up his Newcastle United wage with the same amount of money for him again, which put him in the superstar wage category. But he had to sign a contract to do shows around the Northeast, on stage shows. And, of course, he was like the Pied Piper. He drove everybody crackers. He was absolutely wonderful. And they signed me to do the shows with him on stage. And we did a show at Heaton Buffs, which is where that photograph was taken. And at half-time, when we had the interval off stage, there was a knock on the door. We were in with the committee, KK and myself. There was a knock on the door. Door was open, and it was Brian Johnson, seen there, by the way, without his cap. He's never is these days. I've tended to follow his example. But it was Brian Johnson. He paid his tenner on the door to come in and listen to us as a Newcastle United fan.
Brilliant.
He got up on the chair there. That's my jacket on the back of the chair. He got up on the chair, slapped his hat on top of me, hence my love of caps these days. Etc., etc. He was always over here because his big mate was Brendan Healy, who was a local comedian in Newcastle. But the story, it's amazing what comes round goes round. Geordie had a launch of the latest album, and it was held in Jesmond, in a hotel in Jesmond. And to get extra publicity, they asked Supermac, who was the Newcastle United superstar of the time, whether he would go along for a few drinks at the launch. And because I'm a mate of Supermax and because I was a mate of Brian Johnson's, would I go along as well? So we both went along and met. It was one of the first times I met Carol, who was Brian's wife. And we met Carol, we had a good time, etc., etc. Fast forward yonks and yonks of years, and Brian and Carol have got divorced. Carol's opened a restaurant in Newcastle which was called Reds. Gaza used to go quite a lot to play on the piano. He wasn't supposed to, but he just did. He played on the piano. He wasn't supposed to play on the piano. And lo and behold, what happens? Carol meets Malcolm. Yet again, Malcolm was doing radio at the time, regular radio show. Meets all these years after they met at the Geordie thing, and they end up getting married, and I end up being best man at the wedding, which was fabulous for me, because how often can the best man be a personal friend, not only of the groom, but of the bride as well? Because I knew Carol on our own, in our own right, from going to a restaurant, etc., etc. And I knew Malcolm in his own right. So I managed to be best man to both of them, which was which was fabulous. In those days, the place where we all went, music, where all the boys went for night outs during the first cup run, right the way through the FA Cup of the 70s and the League Cup of the 70s, etc., was a nightclub in town, which is long gone, was called Gray's, at the bottom of Grey Street. You'll probably remember.
Yeah, I remember it, yeah.
Know of it, Gray's, which was run by a guy called David Macbeth, who's still alive now, and he's 88, I think, which is fabulous. And David ran the nightclub Gray's, and we all went in. What people didn't realise was that he was a top tranter in his own right in his own days before he opened Gray's. And of course, he was the resident band in Gray's. He was the front of the band. But he had a song called Mr. Blue, which in 1959 was number 18 in the pop charts in this country, him singing Mr. Blue. He toured, David Macbeth, bless him, and he was a good chanter. He toured with the Beatles, Roy Orbison, Jerry and the Pacemakers. Three times he compared at the London Palladium. He was amazing. And he was a boy and a half, and he was a football fanatic. Yeah, I think he tried to make it with Newcastle United as a kid, never did. But he became a very, very close friend of Jack Charlton, and was always with Jack. He went when the Republic of Ireland made the World Cup finals. David Macbeth went there, etc., etc. And even when we went to the European Phase Cup, this is before Jack's days with Newcastle, but when we went to the Phase Cup, the entertainment on the night after we won the Phase Cup, back in the hotel, was David Macbeth singing to the boys at the party afterwards. So we took our own celebration crew out with us, which was amazing. But biggest name of the lot, and it means something to you, has got to be the fella from Wallsend, Sting.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't get much bigger on the world stage than Gordon Sumner. And his background was amazing. I mean, he was the son of a Wallsend milkman who later went in the shipyards, and a hairdresser. And he lived on Station Road, Steve, which, as you well know, for donkey's years, was the headquarters of Wallsend Boys Club, the very famous Wallsend Boys Club. And Sting used to go down to Wallsend Boys Club and play football on the five-a-side, the indoor five-a-side. Now, maybe if he had stuck in with that, he could have made a name for himself until he was about 31 as a footballer, but he didn't. So he made the best of what he could do as a singer, and I don't think he did too badly. I mean, the interesting thing was that the two guys who had a lot to do with him as he was growing up in Newcastle, I got to know ever so well, because David Stapleton was a guy who, when I was sports editor at the Chronicle, he used to write the school's football column for me in the paper, reporting on what was happening in the school's football. And he was a classmate. He was in the same class at school at St. Cuthbert's with Sting, David Stapleton. And the PE teacher at that school was a guy called Tony Knox, who was a footballer that played for Whitley Bay and played for the England amateur side. And they both remember the young Sting so well. And I mean, David Stapleton says his nickname then wasn't Sting, which he got, remember the Gansey with the stripes on it that made him look as if he was a wasp, and therefore he got the name Sting. His nickname when he was at school was Noddy. Now, whether that because he nodded in agreement to everything or he nodded off during the lessons, I'm not certain, but he was called Noddy. And I talked to Tony Knox about Sting, and he said he was a top athlete. He was a Northumberland Dun sprint champion as a kid. I mean, a top man. And when he became what he become. We met him 2 or 3 times, and he, funny enough, not so long ago, he was appearing in Newcastle with Shaggy. Quite an unusual link because they're not the same sort of singer, as you would well know, at all. But they went together, they did an album together, and it worked brilliantly because there were contradictions that complemented each other. And they put a show on at Newcastle, and Sting was looking at the time that he might back financially the making of Carrying David, which would be a film about Glenn McCrory, my mate, his life story with his young brother who had a muscle wasting disease, etc., etc. It's a very emotive, very emotional, very tender story, and Sting was thinking of actually backing it financially, and we went to that gig in Warp afterwards with him and with Shaggy talking about it. The trouble was, it's never quite got off the ground because I think Sting was anxious for his wife to produce it, and that wasn't going to happen, so the whole thing didn't happen. But happy days. Lindisfarne, can you remember them?
Oh yes, yeah.
Extra special days with them. I remember I lived at Wickham, Steve, at the time when Wickham got to the final of the FA Vase, Wickham Football Club. As you know, because you're non-league connections as well with Dunstan, etc., etc. I mean, northeast sides just dominate the Vase. Just every year, I think they feel absolutely sick of us, which is why they've brought this compulsory situation where if you win the Northern League now, you've got to take promotion. If you go beyond the Northern League, you can't play in the Vase anymore. But anyway, they got to the Vase final, and I was living in Wickham at the time, and I wrote a couple of things. I was doing Newcastle United, but I wrote a couple of things about Wickham being in the Vase, and I thought, you know what, these lads, terrific local footballers that did Wickham proud, but I thought there must be 11 more famous people live in Wickham than the players who are actually going to go to the Vase. So I thought, I'll tell you what I'll do for a bit of fun. I'll try to put 11 together of well-known faces. All have got to live in the village at Wickham. I talk to Newcastle United. I'll take them all up Newcastle United. I'll get them all dolled up in black and white strips like Newcastle. Get them out on St. James's Park. We'll pose in the normal way and get a team photo taken, which and then carry the team behind the team in the Chronicle, meaning these lads will be supporting the lads who are actually going to play. And I put that team together, and amongst the names that appeared there was Nigel Walker, that played for Newcastle at one time, Steve. You would remember him. Mick Martin, who was who captained Newcastle at one time. Mike Neville, can you remember the face that used to be on BBC and Time TV?
Yeah.
On the nightly news programme. Myself, obviously, and Alan Hull lived in Wickham. Alan Hull, who was the real inspiration behind the Lindisfarne. So there he is with his long shaggy hair in the picture. I mean, his legs, far from having footballers' legs. Yep, there he is. Bless him. Second on the left. Ray Laidlaw, who's second on the right, is somebody who I still deal with an awful lot today. He worked the camera when I did appeared on a video of Bobby Robson when the special ceremony was held at Durham in memory of Sir Bobby. But poor old Alan Hull, his legs were like pipe cleaners, and they were as white as pipe cleaners as well. I think I could put my fingers like that round his thighs. Like less likely to be a footballer is Alan Hull, but great lad. And I mean, bless him, his lifestyle. When you took in the fags and you took in the pints, you thought this lad is not quite a rock and roll lifestyle, but it's off pushing the boundaries, and bless him, it was pushing the boundaries. But a unique talent, and precious to have had a little bit of time with him. If we go back far enough, can you remember? I think I've told you before. We've talked a bit before, Steve, about when I went to Las Vegas with Len Shack.
Yeah.
Which, funny enough, it was with a sporting club before you lifted boxing in this area to the heights you did with all the local fighters and the bills you put on, and then you brought in the top names for shows. We remember all those and still do. But there was a Northeast Sporting Club was set up by a guy called Robinson from Scarborough, and they flew us out to Vegas. And one of the things I was doing while I was out in Las Vegas was meeting Sonny Liston. And that's the scariest man I've ever met in my life. I mean, he terrified me just because he just sat. He hardly spoke to him. He just glowered at you the whole time you were there. The guy, I was absolutely mortified. Eventually a guy come in to take a photograph that I wanted for the paper. And he puts his hand up on my shoulder, and he's got this big melon grin on his face and looks like an absolute pussycat, which is the last thing we wanted. We wanted to see the horrible, nasty, fearsome guy that Sonny Liston was. Anyway, on that trip, Shaq, who had played football out there, that's you can see me second on the right there, and just behind William McKeague, you can see Shaq's head. That is when William McKeague got the freedom of the city of Las Vegas from the mayor, who's the second on the left there. He got the freedom of the city and got the key to Las Vegas. And Shaq was his favourite footballer, and he wanted me there, so it was reported back home in Newcastle. Willie McKeague did. The amazing thing is, at the end of that ceremony, the mayor, who looks a bit like Giant Haystacks there, suddenly says to Shaq and I, "Are you all right, guys? I hope you've had a good time, guys. There you go. There's a key for you and a key for you. Thank you very much." So William McKeague, whose office had organised this over weeks before we went out there, at the same time as he got the freedom of the city, so did Len Shack and myself. But that didn't make the report I did when I got back home. Reported on Willie McKeague getting it. But while I was out there, Shack, he played out there for Sunderland, in the old days, and had got a fortune because he was the superstar, the trickster, the ball player, flicking the ball about. And so he was the superstar, so he got extra money. He had to appear in the matches, and he didn't bring it out. He left it in a bank account, and so he used that bank account while we were there. And he took me out virtually every night, knock on the door, open the door. He'd have a mohair suit on, his shirt with his initials on the shirt, looked $1 million, and I'm looking like ready for bed because I'm knackered. And I said, "Look, I've got no money, Shaq. Honestly, I can't come out in Vegas. Don't get me on the wheel or do I can't." He said, "It's on me, boy." And we took it. One night we went and saw Judy Garland. The next night we went and saw Sammy Davis Jr., which was staggered. There they are. They were on separate bills at separate hotels when we were out there. And we all know the unique talent, but I've never seen such a contradiction in my life, because Judy Garland, bless her, was at the stage of her life where she came on stage and started singing until somebody told her she was facing the wrong way. She had her back to the audience and she was facing the back of the stage, and somebody had to turn her around so that she was facing the right way. And far from the audience being upset at that, they all got up and gave her a huge round of applause. Now Judy and all that, and I'm thinking, are you for real? The next night we saw Sammy Davis Jr., who was unbelievably professional, flicking the fingers, and the lights went out, the lights come on. Amazing. But special times. Moving on quickly because time is. Elton John. There's a figure that I got to know ever so well because of his love of football. where it all started was the Sports Aid Foundation. I used to front the Sports Aid Foundation dues in Newcastle, and I had a dinner in the early 80s, and they got Elton John to be the guest speaker there. Part of the deal was that I would be able to have an interview with him in the afternoon, which is where that photograph was taken, in his suite in the Gosford Park Hotel. And it was obvious that Elton thought, oh, this is going to be a pain in the derriere. And he had a flunky come in after half an hour to say, oh, excuse me, Elton, just a reminder that you've got to do this, that, and the other, and he could wrap it all up. But we got on so well because he wanted to talk about football because he was the Watford chairman. I wanted to talk about football because I covered Newcastle United and I was interested in what he was doing with football. Everybody wanted to talk to Elton John about music. So he was so thrilled that when the flunky come in, he dismissed him and said, hey, forget about it. We were there for 3 hours talking about football. He had Graham Taylor was his manager at the time at Watford, the old England manager, and Watford were going like a nosebleed from the old 4th division up into the 1st division and eventually to the FA Cup final at Wembley, where he famously sat in the royal box with tears in his eyes because Watford had got there. And the Chronicle carried that interview under a big banner which says John meets John, which was clever. And I mean, we got on so well at the night time when we went down to do the dinner at the Civic Centre. Elton went up on the top table, saw where the nameplates were. He was sitting in the middle of the table. I was sitting right down the bottom of the table as the compere, and he was sitting next to various local dignitaries. And he just got the nameplates and moved them all around. So I was sitting next to him in the middle, and we could continue to talk about football. And the other guys were just pushed sideways. And he wore his cap like that all night. I've liked caps. Brian Johnson, Elton John, John Gibson isn't cap these days. And he kept... One of the reasons he wore a cap like that at the time was his hair was going thin. Doesn't look like it on the sides, does it? It was thick on the sides, but it was going thin on the top. And he was having a hair transplant. And he didn't want any of the fans to see that. So he kept touching the brim of his hat as if he was going to lift it up, and everybody in the audience would go, because they thought they were going to see what was under there, which was virtually nothing, but he never did. He never lifted it up all night. A lot of fun. But the last one I want to come to is Jerry Lee Lewis. But just before I do, the background, Glenn McCrory, you well know, us both so well, Steve. Very close friend of mine. There he is with me in at the Civic Centre in Newcastle. Great friend of mine. Him and Malcolm MacDonald are two of my closest mates of everything that's happened in my life in sports reporting. And we had done a show. We did a show. A couple of things happened. We did a show at the in Newcastle together, which was called The Fighter and the Writer, and it was done at the Stand Comedy Club in Newcastle. They'd seen us on stage together in a couple of things and said, "Why don't you do a show down here?" But to give us the whole night, and said, "It's your show, you two do anything what you like with it." Well, we realised we couldn't do a show just talking to each other for the whole night. That was expecting too much. So Glenn knew a lot of people, and we said, "Look, what the hell can we do?" And we put together a bill where we sat on stage all night, and at one stage, Olivier Bernard, that played for Newcastle, come on as a waiter. We just told him with drinks for the pair of us. We never said who he was. And he'd come and put the drinks down, and you could see everybody in the audience going, "Is that? I'm sure he looks like him. Do you think it is? Is that Olivier Bernard?" It was Olivier Bernard. Supermac come up and joined us and talked. We had a young singer that we'd met in Ireland when we'd been over there a couple of times, a young girl singer. She come on and sung. But the star of the night was a guy called Brian Kennedy. who flew in, who was had become a mate of Glenn's. He flew in from Ireland, especially to sing on this little show. Have you ever been to the Stand?
I have,
Steve?
yeah. It's a great little venue.
Oh, it's absolutely terrific. But you've got to bear in mind it's limited in numbers, in people, etc.
Yeah.
And Brian Kennedy flew in especially to do the show. This guy, he is such a star in his own right. He sang at George Best's funeral in 2005. He sang literally at the funeral, You Raise Me Up, which has become a bit of an anthem and a bit of a football anthem since. He spent 6 years touring with Van Morrison, all over the States and all over this country. He appeared with Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan, Ray Charles, with Van Morrison. He starred in Riverdance on Broadway. That is the sort of quality he had. And he come along and did this show for Gibbo and McCrory in the Stand, unannounced. We hadn't put him on the bill to sell any tickets. And at the end of the show, a couple of people in the audience came over, Steve, and said, oh, I've enjoyed the show so much. Could I book it for my social club? I said, what? You're going to afford McCrory, never mind Gibbo, McCrory, Supermac, Olivia Bernard, Brian, you're going to fly Brian Kennedy in from Ireland. I said, this is a one-off. Everybody did it for nothing. They did it to cover us and get a good show. I said, you can't buy that show in. But that was the level of the show. So that's a sort of relationship I had with, and still have, with McCrory. And we do, and we often do, crazy things. It's almost like dairy. I tell you what, Gibbo, will we try to do that? Yeah, okay, let's try. And one of the things was Jerry Lee Lewis. The background, we decided we were going to bring him to Newcastle. And the background for doing that was that in 1958, at the height of his rock and roll fame, Jerry Lee Lewis was run out of the country because he'd married his 13-year-old cousin, which wasn't illegal in the state in America where they lived, but was certainly illegal, etc. over here. He was run out of the country. It was a huge rock and roll scandal, etc., etc. 4 years later, he was allowed to come back. He was a rebel with a cause. And one of the first places that he was booked to appear when he came back was the City Hall, where he did so sensational. He was actually carried off the stage by members of the audience who had dived up on stage at the final on the shoulders and carried off through the hall. And he wrote in his autobiography years later that was the best show he'd ever done in his life. So McCrory and I suddenly decided, when we remembered that, well, we should bring him back to if this was the greatest show of his life, the great Jerry Lee Lewis played all over the world, why don't we bring him back? So Glenn had met some Scottish guys who were looking after him, and he was coming on a tour over here, but he wasn't coming to Newcastle, he was just coming to Britain. And up to Glen Eagles. So Glenn got in touch with him and said, look, we'd like to bring him to Newcastle. And this is the reason, because he was the greatest. He said it was the greatest gig he ever did. So they put it to Jerry Lee, and he said, yeah, love to do it. So Glenn, I mean, we've got more edge than a broken pot. It's just ridiculous how it come off. Glenn, who was then working for Sky, manages to con Sky Television into sending an outside broadcast team of cameras to the City Hall for the actual gig. And there was an outside broadcast, lorries outside come in to do the show. Mike Allen, who was a Sky director, who had been over in Las Vegas when we did a show about Sonny Liston and Mike Tyson, who's the meanest man on the planet, did this show for us. And we got Jerry Lee in. He stayed in the Copthorne for 4 days, including the night of the gig. he was never seen for the 4 days. You had more chance of seeing Howard Hughes than you had or Shergar as you had of seeing Jerry Lee Lewis. He walked into the Copthorne, went up to his suite of rooms, shut the door. He had he had video games brought into his room so that he could play video games all day. He had all his food in the room, and he never came out until the last night, and it was time to go up to the City Hall for the gig. And I interviewed for the video that came out. I interviewed his band and all sorts of people like that, and I interviewed celebs at the after show party at the City Hall. Remember Chaz and Dave, the London guys?
Yeah.
You know, they came up of their own accord all the way up from London, paying all our fares because there was such in awe of Jerry Lee Lewis and wanted to see him again. And we talked with him after the show, etc., etc. We made a documentary which was called inevitably Great Balls of Fire Pet.
Brilliant.
Because it was in Geordieland. And he went out. It was only 2004. His voice was still as powerful as it ever been. And he's reeling off Great Balls of Fire and all the rock and roll. His piano playing was exceptional. He just about murdered the piano. He was so intense on it. He virtually said nothing. He went from one number to the next number to the next number to the next number. He did 35 minutes, got up, took a bow, said, "Thank you, Newcastle," buggered off and never come back for an encore. We never saw that. That was Jerry Lee Lewis. But the fans, because it was a one-off gig where all these old fans loved him so much, there was people there in drapes and crepe shoes and rocking and rolling in the aisles, down the aisles and all that. I mean, it was a complete time warp, the whole thing. But it was super. And I mean, whatever I've achieved in this life, and it's been a bit hitty-missy, and there's a lot of miss as well as a lot of hate. But apart from what's happened in the world of football with the European Fairs Cup or something, bringing Jerry Lee Lewis back to Newcastle's up there for me. For the musical side of that, I was well chuffed to be a little part of that. So you can see why music has been part of my life for so long. And it's going to be more, mate. Steve, if you come up with any crazy idea and you want some crackerjack to do it with you, give us a buzz and we'll get somebody else.
Gibbo, it's been a refreshing change listening to you talk about your music stuff as opposed to football. But thank you for taking the time to compile that, John. Some great memories, some great recollections. I'm sure the viewers enjoyed it too, mate. Thanks for your time, mate.
Not at all. Absolutely adored it. And slip back into the old football gear now and look after you and Supermac.
Take care, mate. See you later. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.